As everybody's aware, water's been a pretty hot topic in the community for a number of years. And for 2013, it was actually Council's #1 strategic priority. So it's something that we've been working on for a while and been at the forefront. So the idea of the presentation today was to give you a little bit of background on what we've been doing, a little bit about the watershed, and then some options moving forward that we could look at as a community. So, water supply challenges with the Cascade. As you know, as you've seen in recent years, there's potential for drought. More frequent, it appears. There's change in the climate. We're seeing more extremes. It's drier for longer periods, or we get more intense rainfall and flooding. We're seeing increased population growth in the community. It's probably the busiest we've seen in my lifetime here. There's concerns in the community potentially about the use of industrial water, fresh water for industrial purposes, and of course, always the question of how are we going to pay for these improvements in this infrastructure. Opportunities that we have. Our current system is capable of supplying water for approximately 16,000 people. That's with all uses considered. The good news is that gives us time to make decisions on moving forward. Currently, our population between the city of Dawson Creek and the village of Bruce is right around 12,000 people. Looking at growth rates that we've seen in the last 5 years, if that was to continue, we've got more than 20 years before we're going to get close to 16,000 people. The city can always look to partner with senior levels of government, industry, and universities for looking at solutions moving forward. Water security, some people might ask the question, what is water security? Well, this is what I view it as a reliable source of good quality water for all uses now and into the future. On top of that, it has to be effective, practical, and affordable supply system. And I think everybody would agree it needs to protect us against the potential impacts of serious drought or frequent droughts. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Reg. He's going to give you a little bit of background on the Cascade Watershed, some of the work that's going on, and then after he's done, I'll move into some of the options that we're exploring.
20 years worth of work that the city's invested in when it first did its first watershed plan back in 1991 with the Ministry of Forests. So the watershed, as you can see in the dark line up there, west of Dawson Creek and to the south, is about 2,800 square kilometers in area. And that's about the same area as the lower Vancouver mainland, so it's quite an area. It has two branches to it. The main Cascade is divided into the east and west Cascade. And so places like One Island Lake are within the watershed. Bear Hole Lake, you can see the dark green area is a big protected area. We've got smaller lakes, and basically those lines on that graph show you how the watershed is broken down into smaller, what we call sub-basins. So that's how we look at the watershed. So here's a picture that shows the whole system. So there's Bear Hole Lake up there, where we have a weir that's been installed for a few years now to raise that water level for emergency use, if it ever should be needed. That water travels down the East Cascade River through a distance of about 170 kilometers until it eventually gets down to Arras, in the top picture on the right. And the next picture below, you can see our weir and the pump house on the river. From there, the water goes through a series of reservoirs, eventually reaching the treatment plant, as you can see at the bottom. We take that water, which, as we all know, is pretty muddy water, and we take it off initially in the spring for sure. We take it through a series of treatment processes. So you can see how it starts on the left and what it ends up on the right when it finally goes through the disinfection process. Eventually the water goes through the city, through all the distribution, and ends up near the airport, through a lagoon lagoon system, which is aerobic and anaerobic. And now part of that system, that water's been taken off from the waste treatment and is channeled through a reclamation facility, which is one of the unique projects actually as well for industrial purposes. So that's a wastewater reclamation. That water is treated as well, and for the water that's used for industrial purposes, or for eventually for community use, for public works eventually, and it can be discharged back into the Fuskupi and into the Peace River. So that's the whole sort of water cycle of our system. When we look at the different pieces of the work that we do, there's really 5 parts to it. So what's our source water, the watershed? What do we do in the treatment? How do we get it to people's taps, the distribution? What do we do with it when it's done through the waste? And now we've added a 5th component, a reclamation part of it. So I'm only going to speak briefly about the watershed part. And there's 3 parts of the work that I do with the help of people like Chelsea and others and consultants. We do community outreach. We're trying to educate people about water use and conservation. We're trying to educate people about the watershed itself, where they get their water, and the challenges that we have in managing the water. We have a big effort that's focused on research. We really didn't have a lot of good information about flows in the river, about groundwater, about some of the management issues. So the focus was put onto that piece in the last few years particularly. And finally, we have to also think about who's making the decisions about the watershed. So government agencies that have a say, we also have to interact with them. So we have 3 goals with the program. It's obviously to maintain a safe and secure drinking water supply. We have to consider that there's being multiple uses, not just water use needs for the city. There's fish, wildlife, social, various cultural, recreational, etc. activities there. But we also have to consider what are the potential risks to the water quality and flows. We have to, under the Drinking Water Protection Act, actually have a plan. It's called a Source Water Protection Plan, which we're responsible for keeping track of things. And if we report any activities, example of a flood, or we have any concerns, we report that to you, the public, and to the health agencies, and they tell us we have to do something. Obviously, those of you that know what happened in Shetland, their water system was shut down because of an oil spill. We don't have that case now. We used to have an oil line that was running with oil through it above the intake, 11 kilometers, but that's no longer in use at this point. We have other issues, and we're managing for groundwater. So there's an example of groundwater that's under pressure in the aquifer, in the watershed. So understanding what's happening in the river. We've had this cycle in the system, obviously, because it's rain and snow melt, we get the big melt off in the spring. On top of that, though, we have groundwater that feeds the river. So what we've been doing is actually studying how much water is actually feeding that river, feeding into it from the shallow groundwater into the system. We've actually been able to get some early numbers that are showing about, if you take all the water that flows through the whole watershed, over the course of 1 year, 3/4 of that water is actually fed by groundwaters. That's a very important thing to know because it tells us our system actually has that ability to feed itself. Obviously during the winter is what we rely on groundwater feeding the city's water supply. So what happened last summer was actually like being in the middle of winter. That's exactly basically the situation. Now the river itself is, a lot of you that have been on the river know it's very erodible. So we have to always understand we're going to get natural erosion and lots of turbidity to manage for it. And so that's why the system's been built the way it is. So here's the big super flood event. Pretty rare, but it looks like 10 years that we've had those peak flows. We've got water quality challenges. Fortunately, industry is built to a standard when they build their well sites, they have to have berms so water is contained. If it does, in this case in 2011, it's contained. So your job is to take a look at this and say how much of that water perhaps got off lease and how do we track that and see if there's anything that shows. Fortunately, we haven't seen any contaminants come into the water system, and we continue to track that at least 4 times a year. But now we're expanding our system, so we're tracking the water further up. Now, an interesting thing that we found out through a study of the Forest Practices Board is we take the number of days when the water level hits what's called natural definitely turbidity units. that is a measure of how much silt or mud, let's say, is in the water. And if we get that level up over 500, we can't pump it. So there were many days, years ago, when there were many consecutive days where it was always over 500. What we've actually seen now, and I think it's partly because of climate change, is that the amount of number of days where it's up at that level has actually declined. So there's fewer number of days in the river where it's over that 500 level. So that's an important change. We've also seen the total organic carbon coming down over the last 10 years. So we're seeing, well, erosion issues are still there, but also management practices. We haven't had as much of some of the development activity, big scale logging, there's protection of the streams. There's crossing issues that we manage, but we have to realize that it's over a long period of time that we have to track change. Water use by all industries, obviously a lot of concern about how much water is being used by industry. So there's other users. So there's transportation, there's irrigation, there's all kinds of other users. So we look at the amount of water that's used in different pits. We get a referral, so we get sent that information to know whether it's, in this case, like a water storage pit being built. Or in this case, on the top left there, they're actually moving water from a groundwater pit to another pit under permit. And there you can see a frac operation of the amount of water. Now, if you take all the permitted water, so that's all the water that's the government issues by license, including the Oil and Gas Commission. You take all the water that's held back and permitted and held back at One Island Lake, Cutback Lake by Ducks Unlimited, water that's used for irrigation, water that's used by the city. And you take all the water that flows out of the whole watershed, that represents the big circle. The amount of water that's actually permitted is the blue triangle. So this is one of the things that we have a big challenge in understanding and communicating is how much water is actually in the watershed, how much is being permitted, and of that little piece of the pie, how much do we actually use? And the actual use is actually even smaller than that. So we know from many years of studying through the government, these are the government's own studies and we're continuing to understand it, is something like 255 million cubic meters runs by the Arras Weir through the whole year. We added up all that water. The amount of water that's permitted is somewhere in that range of 7 to 7.5 cubic meters, million cubic meters a year. So our use is about half of that. When we study the watershed, a lot of you that have been up around Tucker Ridge and get back in the Forest Service Road, Upper Cascadna, and usually involved in the industry up there, you know how pretty wet it is. So there is, in these dark patches here, shows you where the surface water is, so where the actual lakes or water that's held back along river courses by beavers, by wetlands, and the darker shades are where that surface water is stored. So we've got a huge reserve, and a lot of that is actually protected and bearable. So we've actually got a lot of water that's sitting back on the top of the watershed, up in East Cascadna, that makes its way down and seeps into the river. And that's why, in fact, we've got water in the winter, because that water is seeping into the system. You've got water that comes in on these head walls that are seeping in on the head walls. There's water that seeps in right directly under the river, feeds it in. When the water drops, we're finding more of the water is feeding in. Here's a picture, this is in early October, during the drought, when in fact we did a release of Bear Hole Lake, and there was a big, if you remember, the first snowfall and the first bit of rain, that's what the water level changed to within about a week. So that water was flowing. It may not have been flowing all that way down to lower Cascadna near Farmington Bridge where they monitor it, but it was flowing that much in the upper part. The other piece of work that's being done in the last many years is they studied the water that's deep underground. So that's deep bedrock groundwater, or aquifers. Before, all they used to know was it was in the light brown. It was only where they knew where those deep bedrock aquifers know. Now they've studied water wells all around the country, and they've been able to show that the water area, these deep aquifers, are actually that broader area. So you can see Dawson Creek and Southland told there's lots of places in town where that water comes pretty close underneath these businesses. So that's the actually deeper groundwater. When you come up to the surface, the shallower where it's sand and gravels, that area on the right in yellow is now known as the shallower. So you can see it's pretty much the same. There's a lot of water that's closer to the surface on the water project. They were able to map that. When you go west of Arras, so if you just follow the line there, the 208 road, from the city to where it says Arras, these are all private water wells. Not a whole lot, but important to see here, a lot of those wells are close to the river. So these are private wells. Some of the water may be actually be used for commercial and industrial purposes. But we know that water varies quite a bit. So we want to study that. We want to know what's actually happening in the river. So we want to study that. So we started to look at that. But we don't know a whole lot about from Arras over towards the city, is how much of that groundwater is actually there. People say up around Bear Mountain there's lots of springs, and people know about flowing wells west of Arras. So what we did is we can actually, it's like cutting a straight cross-section across the land. So you're looking down towards from Arras, you're looking off to the right towards Dawson Creek. You can see the highway there. If we actually look at those wells, these are actual wells, you can see they're not very highly productive, but in the range of 50 to 75. When you get closer to the river, you see the big blue blob there. Just imagine deep down underneath the river is an old glacial channel. And that's basically what's feeding a lot. They've really done a lot to study. This is called an old glacial channel. So that water is also being drawn upon more recently. I've heard it's producing up to around 200 gallons a minute. Now it's different chemistry. There's issues to understand, but it's just to show this is how we're starting to put the picture together. So where are we at right now in terms of the program is that we continue to want to encourage people to conserve water at all times. It's good practice to learn how to save if you can, and there's technology there now with drinking water faucets to washing machines, and if you're paying for water, you should really save to save it. Using and classifying and protecting groundwater is an important thing to know. We want to know if there's any going to be changes if we got wells that are on the land that might have an impact. We want to study that. We want to study more of what could be changing over time. But these are long horizons here. They want to actually try and get to a point very soon where we can have a working group of people with government, with industry partners, with some of the public to actually start to manage and make more decisions about water. If we ever have to start limiting, right now the city is not being told by industry or by government to restrict its water use. They're saying you've got a license, continue to manage it, you've got conservation measures. When that has to kick in, that has to kick in when the water flows get really low. So we hit a certain level, we have to kick in those conservation measures. That's part of the license. When it comes to other quality issues, I raise these concerns. At this point, I don't have people writing to me from government or Northern Health saying we got serious issues. We're trying to keep ahead of it. It's basically what the program is about. So getting it formally established as a designated watershed, we think is important. We've got very good cooperation right now. We get referrals of projects from industry, and we're getting to find out more. There's still water being permitted as we speak right now in the Upper Piscataqua, and the studies are being done to show that they can take that much water that they need for a few of those wells. Analyzing and managing bare hole is another big part of what we want to do. So as I go forward with, in terms of recommending where we're going with the program, the comments I get from people that work, know a lot more specialized background than I have, they talk about the watershed as being resilient, it's still producing water, but obviously you want to have backup supply when you run into these low flow periods, and it's been mentioned about climate change. We want to continue we are managing the development activities, we're finding best practices to control erosion. We don't want to have extra erosion that we have to deal with more problems. We know we got bacterial issues, we can treat these issues, but we still want to encourage, off-river branching, off-water sources. We want to talk still about water conservation measures and continue to do ongoing research and monitoring. So that is a picture. We've got more slides and pictures that I can talk about and take whatever questions we can, and if I can't answer it, we can get back to you.
Thanks, Reg. So just a quick little snapshot of our usage in the community in 2012. Everybody's always wondering where our water goes and who uses it. Quickly, residential is about 42%. ICI, which is industrial, commercial, and institutional, 44%. Agriculture, small percentage. Currently, we're using just over half of what we're allotted. Our permit of the Kiskadna is 3.3 million cubic meters annually. Last year, I think we were about 2.3 million cubic meters. Our per capita use, now I base this on our census data. If you look at what we used last year, it's approximately 550 liters per person per day, and that includes all uses, including fracking. But if you back fracking out of that, that use in 2012 was approximately 13.5% of our total, comes up with approximately 475 liters per person per day. So our current system, it was constructed back in, I believe, 1943. U.S. Army constructed the line into town. Like I mentioned, we have a permit for 3.3 million cubic meters annually. In 2009, we amended that permit to allow us to extract up to 18,000 cubic meters per day. The idea behind that was, we know the Kiskadna has variable flows. This allows us to take more water when the flows are high, and then when the flows are low, limit our extraction. So our average is only 9,000 a day, but 18,000 when the flows are high. Storage capacity is something that we've worked on over a number of years. We've got a number of reservoirs between the river and town. We've also got the weir at the intake of the Kiskadna, and more recently we have the weir at Bear Hole Lake, which is listed in that picture there. Some of the limitations with our current supply system. It lacks long-term storage. We have approximately 3 to 4 months worth of storage between the river and town. The existing system, like I mentioned earlier, will not provide enough water for a population beyond 16,000. Drought considerations. As we well know, over recent years, we've seen more and more droughts, drier summers, unpredictable weather. As you see, 92, 2002, and so on, it seems like those years are getting closer and closer together. During those droughts, I want to point out that although lawn watering might have been affected at times, at no time was anybody restricted to using water for what would be considered necessary use, as far as, washing, drinking, cooking, the necessities of life. So, and during that same period of time, I think the industry was prohibited for about 60 days, more recently in 2010 and 2012. So a few other considerations is that commercial and industrial use in 2012 accounted for 44%. Out of that, gas fracking peaked in 2010 at 17% of that usage. It's been decreasing in recent years, and indications certainly point to that being a continuing trend. Industry tells us that they're looking for alternatives, whether it's salt water or other alternatives from fresh water. And of course, there's other considerations such as senior levels of government and what may happen, changes with regulations, freshwater moving forward. So now I'll give you a brief overview of some of the options that we're exploring. And some of these options we've looked at in the past, but we've really focused on storage and building that storage. And we were looking at that again with the potentially building a new reservoir west of town. And we had a local group of people come forward with a proposal about a pipeline. So it was at that time council decided that, that idea had some merit, and we needed to take a step back, and we needed to engage the community and really have the discussion on what might be appropriate for the community moving forward. So we're going to look through these options. Certainly the ones we've got listed here may not be all the options, and we're certainly open to more. But the ones that we looked at is upgrading the existing system, building a new raw water reservoir storage, tapping into groundwater aquifers like Reg mentioned. We're learning more about that all the time. Or look at a new water pipeline to a different source. So upgrading the existing system, what that really means is continual improvements like we've done really over the last couple of decades. We've added the weirs, we've added some storage. There's always work being done to improve that system. As I mentioned, the system would meet the demands of the community up to about 16,000 people, or upwards of 20,000 without the industrial use. It will not reduce the impact of drought beyond what we have today. Estimated investment over the next 20 years is going to be about $16 million, and we took that number based on what we spent in the previous 20 years with these improvements that we've done. Operational costs remain relatively low and consistent with what we see today. So the question that comes out of that is, do we continue to upgrade the existing system knowing that water restrictions may be still in effect in the future in times of drought? Another option was building a raw water reservoir. Like I mentioned, this was something that we had identified a number of years ago. Council purchased the land in 2007, just west of town. The land is strategically located that it can be filled by gravity, and we can take it out of gravity, so there's no pumping associated with that. The storage would increase to a point where we have about 1 year's worth of water storage between the river and town. The estimated investment for this project would be about $22 million, and the operational cost would be low, again, because there are no pumping or operational equipment required. So the question that comes from that is, do we invest $22 million in a new water reservoir that will reduce the impact of drought, because we'll have that storage in times of drought that can get us through those 3-4 months maybe of those summer months, but it will not give us more capacity as far as population growth, and it will not meet future demand needs beyond that population of 16,000. Groundwater aquifers. As Rich pointed out, we're learning more and more about that. There appears to be significant volumes in the Arras area aquifers. Certainly could be something that could augment the system during drought periods. Lower mainland, they are going as far as storing water in aquifers and pumping it down, and then when they need it, pulling it back out. We've got some information, but it's still fairly new, so is it something that we want to explore further? So the question, do we continue to research the possibility of aquifers to boost our current water supply in times of drought? The next option is a pipeline to a new source. So we had a group of citizens that come forward to council introducing the idea, again, that we should explore looking at a pipeline to a new source, whether it's the Murray River or the Peace River. Based on the information that we were given during that presentation, the pipeline would accommodate a population of in excess of 26,000 people. It would greatly reduce water restrictions during drought because of the supply. And the estimated cost to construct the pipeline was $57 million. And that did not include operational costs or land acquisitions for the pipeline. So the question, do we invest $57 million now in a new water source that would minimize the impacts of drought and meet water demand for all uses into the future? Like I said, there may be other options, other ideas, and I'm hoping I'll hear some of those as I walk around tonight, or certainly leave those on your feedback forms. I think council is committed to look at any option that seems viable and worth exploring. It's important to note that the outcome of this session is really just the beginning. We're not going to walk out of here today and start building whatever decision may come. I think it's important that we need to go through the process, and that at least a couple of those projects are going to require some significant resources. There's going to be more studies to be done to get those detailed information, and they're going to have to come to the public with that information and look at a referendum to borrow the funds. So certainly you can learn more. Like I pointed out, we have displays here, we have the newsletter, and if there's any questions, staff will be here. Certainly I'll do what I can to answer those questions. And our website as well has information. It's got a shorter version of this presentation if you can't sleep at night and you really need to put yourself to sleep. And there's a feedback form that you can do online there. We also have an iPad in the back. You can do it online there, or you can fill it out and leave it in the Dropbox. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen. If there's any